And then the end is that I learned.
Always a good ending.
I I agree. I agree.
All right. Welcome back to episode 8 of The Virgin and the Bees. I'm very excited to be joined today by Carly Shaul. Hi, Carly.
Hi.
So, Carly and I met in high school, like freshman year. So, very fun times, 14. I think we actually
Mhm.
met earlier than that. We met in middle school, but we were like became close in high school. So yeah, it's been a pleasure to know her and stay connected on social media and whatnot as people do these days. And she is very like awesome person, very educated on topics of mental health and sexual wellness and all that good stuff that we like to talk about here. She actually has her master's in psychology and she's working as a therapist right now as an associate marriage and family therapist. So, yeah, so glad to have you here, Carly.
Thanks for having me, Zarina. I'm so excited to talk about everything that we're going to talk about today. And I think even in talking about mental health, a lot of how I got to there in the first place is through sexuality and just being interested in sexuality.
Mm.
So I'm excited to kind of join the two a little bit and just get to talk about everything today.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I love that being able to kind of mesh the 2 because sexuality is so, like, embedded in a lot of different
Mhm.
aspects of our lives. It's not just this, like, "Oh, little solitary corner of sexuality in my life, and that's it," you know? So it's great to kind of
Mhm.
see how it enmeshes in other aspects, especially mental health,
Totally.
that's a big one. So,
Mhm.
yeah, but I know that you've kind of had some experience with a program at your school, UC Santa Cruz. So I don't know if you wanna talk a little bit more about that and kind of your experience?
Yeah, yeah, I'd love to. So, UC Santa Cruz has this program called SHOP, which stands for Student Health Outreach and Promotion. And so, kind of a lot of what we did was focused around sexual health specifically. And there had a lot of different volunteer programs that we could do. And the ones that I chose to do were work at Condom Co op, which is we sold condoms 8 for $1. A lot of things when you go to college are free or like pretty cheap. So that was one of those situations where we could like distribute safer sex products in a way that was like pretty low key and
Mhm.
also cheap for students to access.
I love that name, Condom Co-op.
It's the alliteration. It just really gets you.
Yeah. It's
um
cute.
I loved it. I loved it. And I used to do demos there too.
Mm,
Like if
mhm.
anybody wanted one while I was selling condoms, I could always do a demo. And on top of that, I also did some sexual education in this program called Slug Love.
Another
Um,
great name.
it's they had the best names at shop.
By the way, just for people listening, UC Santa Cruz mascot is a banana slug, so that's where the slug comes from.
Yes, we have the best mascot. It's literally what everyone knows us for is the banana slug. It's so cute. And in Slug Love, what we just educated people on consent, safer sex, talking about STIs, a lot of like good info that you don't learn in your high school health classes ever.
Yeah.
So I really enjoyed that. And then I also was a birth control counselor. We had this program called Birth Control Patrol. It's like a
So many
mouthful.
great names.
I know. And so we were like the liaisons, like we were the people that talked to it was mostly women who wanted birth control just about their options, and then we would kind of bring them over to the health center, make sure they were all set up to get the birth control that they wanted. So a lot of great programs, and then one that I didn't work in, we had like peer HIV testing
Oh.
in shop. It was so cool. I didn't get to be a part of that program, but it just sounded like really, really nice to have somebody else who was like a comfortable face be,
Yeah.
being a part of that. So
Yeah,
very
that's
cool.
a very serious kind of thing, so I can imagine it'd be
Yeah.
nice to have, like, a as you said, a comfortable face rather than, like, kind of emotionally removed doctor or something, I don't know,
Hmm.
but yeah.
Definitely. And I think at a certain level, like students kind of understand the culture and what's going on maybe more than adults or like doctors in some ways,
Yeah.
if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it does. It's kind of yeah, kind of that understood, like, I'm not judging you, I'm
Hmm.
sort of thing. But yeah, also I realized I forgot to say my pronouns and you say your pronouns. I'm just
Yes.
gonna say really quick, my pronouns are she and her. And I don't know if you want to share yours.
My pronouns are also she and her.
Perfect. All right. So today we're talking about virginity. Again, a very kind of, integral theme to this podcast. And we kind of just want to talk about virginity as a construct and how it is very molded by society and it, is, as we said, it's a construct. It's not really real. It's what we make it. Also, want to just share, stories. I think one thing about this podcast is listening to different people's experiences with their sexuality, with sex, and their kind of journey with that. And I know that you have a really important kind of story about your journey with losing your virginity and just with sex in general. And so I'd love for you to share that and to hear that about your journey with your vir- virginity. I was gonna say virginity loss. I'm like, that's not the right way to put it. But your journey
Like
with sex.
no, exactly, exactly. And I think the interesting thing is that we like hear virginity and sex talked about in like a very specific way a lot of the time. And I think
Mhm.
that my story, at least, and why I'm excited to share it is that I want to hear stories like mine talked about more.
Mhm. Yeah,
Because of the way that our culture has just shaped it. It definitely makes changes our expectations. So um
definitely.
I'm excited to talk about it. And I think maybe the first piece that I'd like to talk about is talking about virginity itself
Yeah.
and like what it even is,
Yeah.
because it like I think that most people believe it to be just like intercourse in some way or another, but there's so many more pieces that are built into sexuality besides intercourse. And I think it's so interesting that like we're so focused on that specific piece of sexuality.
Mhm.
I don't know. I just think it's interesting that like when you're in a relationship or when you're with a partner of any kind, like you're gonna be doing other things that you might do for the first time, but that's not like, oh, I lost my virginity, I lost my blowjob virginity, or I lost my, like virginity is just specifically with intercourse. And I just think that's so interesting, and it makes sense from the lens of like virginity was created, I think partially with religion and partially with like when the culture was more focused on survival. But at this point, like
Mhm.
that's not where sex and sexuality is. So do we even need a label for it at some
Yeah.
point?
Yeah, it's you mentioned that, there's like blowjob virginity or, when you think about all these things, sometimes people are like, oh, like I lost my like skydiving virginity or I lost my this virginity. Like the only word we have for doing something for the first time is, as you said, like intercourse. And it's such a heteronormative focus. As you said,
Hmm.
it's kind of when we're more focused on survival is kind of maybe when this came in. Yeah, I guess reproduction was kind of more at the forefront, but I don't know, that's like that sounds weird putting it that way, but that's basically what it is. It's centered around sex that can produce a baby. And
Hmm.
even in our culture, it's a lot like, oh, like not like how to do it in ways to not do that. Like, oh, be on birth control or use condoms. Like, it's not even like we're really focused on that anymore unless you're at a place where you want to, then that's
Mhm.
different. But with young people and in high school and college, like there's so much focus on sex for people who don't engage in penis, vagina, intercourse, if
Yeah.
for other things, other forms of sex as their main form, like, like maybe
Mhm.
anal or tribbing or oral. Yeah, or that's a big one too. It's like
Yeah.
that doesn't mean, oh, well, you've never had a penis inside of you or stuck your penis inside someone, so therefore you're a virgin. You've never had an intimate sexual connection. Like that doesn't
Mhm.
make any sense. And I think most people can agree that that doesn't make any sense. But yeah, as you said, like there's so many different layers too. Like those are kind of the more, I think, what we think of in regards to the same quote unquote level as penis vagina intercourse, but there's also
Yeah.
like, kissing and making out and
Mhm.
hand jobs and fingering and, other things that people would consider to be like an intimate thing. And then for some people, sex is not super intimate, it's just
Mhm.
like kind of a bodily fun thing that you do with someone. And for someone else, it can be super intimate. And so
Mhm.
people's approaches to it also can be different. And so, yeah, I think it's really interesting. I was actually reading something where they're talking about how, virginity is a way to almost like, I don't know if policewoman is the right word, but
Mhm.
like this whole concept of purity,
Mhm.
it kind of implies that women aren't inherently sexual, that their worth comes from not engaging in sex, and then it's the
Mhm.
reverse for men, like their sense of manliness comes from engaging in sex, and so it's
Mhm.
like, well, no one wins here. Like if you have sex, someone doesn't win. If you don't have sex, someone doesn't win. And like the whole concept of winning is like completely against the point. But you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like it's kind of just been a way to like put a lot of emphasis of women's worth into marriage and
Mhm.
domestication and just a way to kind of like, as I said, I think police and control are kind of strong words, but
Mhm.
in the sense control a woman's sexuality and sexual behavior.
Absolutely. Just like shaping even our desires and like what we wanna do. Like it determines what we think about and what we do in life, and it kind of prevents women from doing things that men do all the time, and that double standard that's created from it in so many ways, like, does stem from the value of virginity being placed only on women,
Mhm. Yeah.
which is mind-boggling because I've never like, I don't think about it that way often, that, like, men also lose their virginity in the same ways, but it's emphasized totally differently,
Yeah.
and, like, for women, maybe it's shameful, or, like, a lot of women may not tell other people versus, like, men may tell everyone immediately as soon as it's happened. And
Yeah.
I think also the concept of it only happening once, like
Mm,
you're
mhm.
only a virgin until you have intercourse for the first time, and then you never get to use that label again, that like it doesn't exist and your identity shifts in a way because of one decision that you've made with another person.
Yeah, that's such a great point about the identity shift because if you think about it, like with a lot of other experiences, like, yeah, your identity may shift as you grow and change as a person, but there's not a lot of other experiences where you're like, oh, I've done this one thing now. So now my whole identity feels different. Or maybe not whole
Mhm.
identity, but you're not, with most things when you try something new for the first time, it's exciting. And you're like, okay, like I've
Mhm.
experienced this thing, but it doesn't change your sense of who you feel like you are. And we
Mhm.
place so much emphasis on it that it does. The only other things I can think of is
Mhm.
maybe like getting married or something, which is of course kind of intricately tied to that as well.
Yeah.
Um yeah. Yeah, so that's a great thing. And another thing you said also was with guys losing their virginity, like expected to, and probably,
Mhm.
I'm sure feel a lot of pressure to. And I've heard,
Mhm.
especially men who are older virgins, because being a virgin as a woman later is weird because there's that pressure of like, oh, like I'm behind, but also
Mhm.
people kind of fetishize it in a way because of, as you said, like this older archaic notion of purity and waiting until marriage. Hello, it's me, Zarina, in post production, editing the episode. And I just wanted to take a moment to just clarify about something that I just said. I don't mean that waiting until marriage, like that decision, is archaic. I mean more that the archaic notion that a woman's worth comes from whether or not she's engaged in sexual activity. That's kind of what I was getting at. I think an individual's decision on when to have sex is completely their own. And one of my goals and hopes with this podcast is to make people feel valid in their choices, whatever those choices may be. And I think that deciding for yourself to wait until marriage, whether those reasons are religious or not, is totally valid. And I totally respect that. It's just that culture and society using virginity as a way to like control women's sexuality and sexual behavior. So basically, using virginity as a way to strip women of their sexual agency while also objectifying and sexualizing them. I think that's what is problematic and not necessarily an individual's decision on what to do with their body. And that's kind of part of sexual agency, right? Like waiting until marriage, that's a choice. And it should also be a choice to not do that. And so I just think that this whole idea that your worth comes from your sexual activity, that's what's outdated. Yeah. So anyway, I just wanted to clarify that your choices are valid, and back to the episode. But then for guys, like I'm sure they feel a lot of pressure to quote unquote lose it. As you said, that's not a great word to use because what are you even losing? But they have a lot of pressure to have a sexual experience and share that with everyone. And there's also
Mhm.
this kind of, I think, notion that like guys always want to have sex and they're just so lucky to like be able to have sex, which is different to what is, with girls. And I think that's also kind of a bit of a harmful idea, or I guess
Mhm.
societal myth, because guys may not always be horny and want to have sex all the time. They may not want to have
Mhm.
sex with everyone that comes their way,
Mhm.
like they obviously have choice over their sexual behavior and choices as well. And so,
Mhm.
yeah, I think the concept of virginity on the surface, of course, seems like harmful to women. Well, I guess maybe not on the surface, but we're talking about it more in how it affects women, but it also negatively
Mhm.
affects men as well. So I like how you brought
Mhm.
that up.
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's so important, and I even in our education, like I think a lot about our sex education and just how we don't have a lot of understanding and access to how to think about sex in a way that makes it healthy and comfortable and something that's safe. Like I remember a lot of my sex ed, it was just about STIs and that like
Yeah.
mean girls like you will get chlamydia and die like type thing.
Yeah.
Like that was my concern when I was in sex ed, but it wasn't about like we didn't have a conversation about virginity. We didn't have a conversation about how we can use our bodies in ways that are comfortable for us.
Mhm.
Um
Yeah.
and I in my dream world, in my fantasy world, like we had more conversations like this about virginity and how it impacts everyone and how it's like a harmful construct in general
Mhm.
that doesn't need to exist anymore. It's outdated.
Yeah.
Um but at the same time, like we do have a label to describe like, oh, I've never had intercourse with anybody. Like if that's something important that brings you value in some way, then we have a label for it. But otherwise, like I think that it's just harmful to everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's so interesting thinking about like There was this Jubilee video that you showed me that maybe I'll link in the description about asking virgins and non-virgins different questions. And one of them was, do we place too much value on virginity? And I think that's a very interesting question because on one side, kind of what we talked about, it's outdated, it's harmful. Yes, we place too much value on it because it affects the way that we view and act with our sexuality in negative ways, and it shouldn't be such a big deal. But on the other hand, it's weird because it's almost like like two opposites, right? There's one of the purity and waiting until marriage and,
Mhm.
as we said, like, kind of placing that value on having sex or not having had sex, which is harmful. But then there's also this other aspect of pressure from peers, but also I think more than peers is just kind of the overall society and your thoughts of what society is telling you should be doing rather than individual
Mhm.
people from, when you're in high school and college of, oh, like you should be losing your virginity and having casual sex, right? And so
Mhm.
there's kind of these two extremes, and I think both are like, even that side is placing too much importance on it, because if you don't want to have casual sex, and if you're someone who does want to wait until marriage, whether
Mhm.
those reasons are religious or not, whatever that reason is, that is totally valid. And you can totally place importance on your virginity because yes, it's not a big deal to place too much importance on it, but it also is a very intimate thing that you can
Yeah.
share with someone. And so that's something that you totally have the right to decide when you want to engage in that
Mhm.
behavior. And so I think if you want to place importance on it, you can in ways that are good and healthy for you and what you want. But as a society, we place too much pressure on it in these two very different ways. Whereas I think it should be in the middle, where it's
Mhm.
people like don't care if you've lost your virginity or not, and focusing on more about like, oh, who's this person as a person, rather than
Mhm.
placing a lot of importance on whether or not they've had sex, whatever sex means to them.
Mhm. Totally. And I think that thinking about it in that way is really cool because it gives you a lot of control. And just like any other identity that you have, like you can tell people, you cannot tell people, you can keep it to yourself, and you can weigh how much it impacts you and how you believe you are.
Mhm.
And I
Yeah.
agree that like the societal impact on top of the peer impact, like it all works together in that way to like bring you this conflict that you don't necessarily need, like, this conflict
Yeah.
of, like, "Oh, when am I gonna lose my virginity?" Or, like, "Is this the person?" Like and a lot of people, I think, in their fantasies, at least I know when I was in high school and I would think about losing my virginity, like, it's brought up in this way that's so, fantasy-like, "Oh, it's gonna be perfect, where there are gonna be roses everywhere," like,
Yeah.
that whole idea
Yeah.
that I saw on TV over and over again of, like, it's planned out, it's like there's just a lot of, um, societal messages that we're given,
Yeah.
on top of this thing that is just a piece of our identities at the end, like, just an experience that we've had or haven't had that could matter or could never need to be talked about ever.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
definitely. Yeah, as you said, kind of the, like, roses on the bed and candles lit, like, that's what a lot of women are told growing up. And
mhm,
so if you don't have that, and also if it's not a great experience, because sometimes, if you don't know what you're doing, which a lot of people don't their first time, and you're not properly aroused and prepared, it can be painful and just not super enjoyable, especially if you're like nervous and in your head. Like, those are things that can, contribute to a not as great sexual
mhm,
experience. And so if it's not this amazing thing, then it can, I mean, I don't speak from personal experience, but like I'm assuming that it could be like a
yeah.
kind of a letdown and a disappointment. And
Mhm.
also, of course, slut shaming is like a whole other topic, and people feeling dirty after sex, especially
Mhm.
women. And the differences that when you're young, a woman has after sex versus a man, simply because of this concept of virginity and purity
Mhm.
that our society has upheld for a long time. And I think it's starting to get better, but it's still there. At least, I
I
don't know, maybe Gen Z
I
is like
know.
tearing it down more, but from when we were in high school, it was definitely still there.
Mhm.
But yeah.
Totally. And that I think kind of like leaks into my story a little bit of like we have this idea of virginity, and when I was with my partner I had this idea of what virginity might look like, and in my
Mhm.
experience losing my virginity like wasn't necessarily even close to matching the idea and the conceptualizations of like what it was supposed to look like, I guess.
Yeah.
So I know for me I can kind of like lead into my story a bit about like I was 16 or 17. I started having a relationship with my first like serious boyfriend. I'd had a lot of boyfriends beforehand, but we had dated like a few months at a time or things like that, or it didn't work out with people before. But
Mhm.
in this relationship, like we had said we loved each other. It was um I was in this relationship where I felt like we were really close, and I it was kind of codependent in a way, like looking back at it now, like 6 or 7 years after. I would spend every day with him and we just were very close. And at the time, like I am a very different person now than I was before. And so I look back and I see like the person that I was at the time in this relationship, and like I was so not in the mental health space, or I didn't have the communication skills. I didn't have just the ability and knowledge to be sexual in the ways that I think are safe and comfortable for me now. So being in that relationship was interesting, and being at that time where like that is typically the time where like people lose their virginity, and that whole thing, like those societal pressures on top of me not being the person that I am today, I think like led me to this experience that's different than the experience that like TV leads you to believe, I guess, in a lot of ways. And I think like I have some trouble talking about it because I know that there's a lot of people who have experienced like trauma around sex, and I the last thing that I want is for anybody to feel re-traumatized at all by my experience. And I also like have had good moments and have had positive sexual experiences since these experiences, but for me at the time, like this was like not a positive sexual experience for me from how I reflect on it now, if that makes sense.
Definitely, yeah, and thank you so much for sharing this. I really appreciate
Yeah.
it. Yeah.
Yeah. Exactly. So I mean it just is a fact. In conversations with talking about this with my therapist in the past too, like um it just is my truth and my fact, and that's like just something that I am confident in dealing with, and know that the reason that I'm sharing it isn't to be like, oh, this here's my bad experience, my bad sexual experience, but like the reason that I'm sharing it is that like I think a lot of people who lose their virginity have the same experience as me, and just nobody talks about it. And
Mhm.
just the gist of why I'm talking about it is that I think it's important to have these conversations and to set our expectations differently, and just I think it was a lesson for me that I'm hoping that other people can take, people who maybe haven't lost their virginity yet, or people who are with a partner and are thinking about it, like to take the lessons that I've learned and use them with themselves so that they can have better experiences than I remember having. Um,
Definitely. And even if you're at a place where you have had sexual experiences, maybe this is something that you can relate to, that you felt alone in, or if you haven't had this experience, it's just, you know, it's always great to hear about other people's experiences and kind of expand your view of what people experience. And so I
Mhm.
think it's valuable for anyone listening, regardless of their experience. But yes, very very happy to hear your advice too for people who maybe haven't gone through this yet. And it might be helpful too for people who have, because
Mhm.
you always, with a new partner, there's always new, or maybe not even a new partner. I don't even know what I'm saying, but with
Yeah.
each sexual experience, there's, you can, the more you know, the more you learn, the more you grow, you can always
Mhm.
bring more and grow more in yourself and in a relationship. And yeah, anyway,
No, exactly, exactly. It's interesting because like we think losing virginity is like a one-time thing, but with every new partner, with every new experience, it's different. So like sex isn't the same thing over and over again. Every time it's different. So even if like you had sex yesterday, like maybe there's something that I talk about today that like can help bring you into a new headspace or just like be an even better place the next time.
yeah.
Um so in talking about my like virginity experience, my partner had a partner before me where he lost his virginity. So he had already not been a virgin by the time we were together, and he had sex before and kind of was in, I think, the socialized headspace that a lot of men are in, and that like we were talking about earlier, where like the idea that sex is an important part of a relationship, or like I had I had felt the pressure to engage in sex and sexual activities because I wanted to make him happy. And the idea is like that couples who like each other and are in a relationship typically like do sexual things because they like each other. And so me as a person who had done nothing but maybe make out with a person beforehand, um it was like all new to me, and like part of it was an experience where I felt pressure, and part of it was an experience where I was like willing to take on new challenges and try new things because I liked him and I wanted to make him happy. Um and I wasn't taught beforehand anything. Like I no knowledge of I had never seen porn before, so I didn't even have like the vague idea of what sex maybe was supposed to look like besides like movies. They don't teach you about consent in high school, at least they
They
didn't
don't.
when we were in high school, so
Yeah.
had no
Which is
idea
really kind
about.
of fucked up when you think about it. Like, there's so
Yeah.
much avoidance, like STIs, STIs,
Mhm.
STIs. Because you were talking about that, and we went through the same, went to high school together. We went through the same sex ed, and it was very
Mhm.
STI focused. And yeah,
Mhm.
no talk about consent at all is like so important to, like, I think, teach young men what consent is and young women what it should look like.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's important for literally every person, and I could go on a huge consent rant, but like the the gist is that like we should be doing things at all times that we agree we want to be doing. And as soon as we agree that we don't want to be doing it, or one of us decides that we don't want to do it, we stop. It's it's like consent is more than just for sex, but in this case, like it was it would have been important if I had known like that even though I'm in a relationship, I still should do things enthusiastically and in a way that I want to be doing them, and that even if you do feel that pressure, that that partner should understand and be okay with it, because at a certain level like you both want to be doing things that you want to be doing together, and that's the gist of it. So a lot of the stuff that I learned about consent I learned after this relationship. And so it's just interesting thinking about me and where my headspace was at the time. Like I knew nothing, so he taught me everything. And everything that he knew. He is a when do we ever listen to 17-year-olds spit? Like sorry anybody young, but like um we don't know anything when we're in high school.
Yeah.
So like looking back at it now, I'm like, oh my gosh, like why did I do this? And I get why, like it makes sense that I wanted to make my partner happy, and that's just like what you do when you're in a relationship. But it's interesting looking back at it now, um and wanting to talk about this, I was trying to think about like what was my first time like, because I really don't even remember it, and that's because like we had a lot of sexual experiences afterwards, and um so it just all like is congealed into one thing for me. But the and I know that we had conversations beforehand where I like had talked about how I'm worried about bleeding, because that's like a huge thing that's talked about, is like we hear the two sides of like it's amazing, it feels great, like, and then we hear the
Yeah.
other side of like it's sloppy, it hurts, that's like not good. And I also have opinions on what like good and bad sex is, because like I don't know if we can even label it one or the other at the end of the day, but like just um having that conversation with him was important, and something that helped me along the way. But I think that the feeling that I have now is that I was not ready to have sex when I did have sex for the first time, and afterwards I just like was not, I didn't have the communication tools to be able to say like I'm not feeling it. Can we do it another time? Like even those little things. And I think that because our relationship was codependent, a lot of my happiness and my well-being I based on whether my partner was happy in our relationship, and I just wanted um him to stick around and like be happy in our relationship together. And not that I was given the information that he wouldn't be, but just it was just like a unconscious message that like I would be disappointing him in some way if I didn't do what he wanted me to do.
Yeah,
If that makes sense. And
definitely.
I think that's felt in a lot of relationships. Like people want to please their partners, and they want to um do things. I think for me, like I have an anxious attachment style, which means that I am worried that people will leave, essentially. Like it's just something that's unconscious within me. And so I think that leads to a lot of people pleasing behavior, and just like me wanting to do things to make other people happy, because I base a lot of my esteem and my happiness on making sure that other people are taken care of, which is like both personality difficulty that I deal with, but also just um, something that I'm working on. But at the time, like total people pleaser, wanted my partner to be happy, so I did a lot of what he wanted me to do because I didn't know anything, and I wanted to make him happy, which makes sense. But looking back at it now, like I felt a lot of um I think unhappiness with myself about my decisions that I chose to make. And um at the time too, I wasn't on birth control, so there's a lot of extra elements of us having talks about condoms, and me making the decision that like, because people with penises say that like sex without condoms feels better, which I'm sure it does. I can't argue that. Um, but eventually it like led to the decision that like, okay, we're gonna try to use the pull-out method. And so that led, and I didn't have birth control. So that led to just like a lot of um internal crises that didn't need to happen in the end. So there was like a this isn't I realize as I'm talking about it, this isn't necessarily a story. It's just like an ongoing experience
Yeah,
that I had. But
that's still a
I
story.
I know it's the whole thing is just the middle, and then the end is that I learned. And
Always a good ending.
I I agree. I agree. And so I think like with all that in mind, it's in talking about it, it's interesting because like I did have good sexual experiences with him. I also had ones that I reflect on as being like hard times in my life. And that's not because of him, but it's just like our developed teenage brains didn't necessarily have like functioning frontal lobes in the way that I do now. I didn't have the communication skills. I don't think that we were on the same page in the way that I'd like to be with my partners now. Um and so I think that like this leads me to thinking about um what I'm hoping, what I have now and what helps me have better sexual experiences than the ones that I had then, and kind of like my hopes that other people have developed within themselves to be able to have good sexual experiences, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. I'm so proud of you for, like, getting to this point where you like, obviously, it's not an easy thing to go through, and so having gone through that and getting to a place now where you feel comfortable to share that publicly and have the, mental capacity to reflect and have this advice on, like, "Oh, here's how I would have done things differently," or and not, like, necessarily, like, as you said, like, it is what it is, like, kind of still accepting and, like, moving on and moving forward and
Mhm.
having, as I said, the space to reflect on that and be at a better place when it comes to your relationship with sex and your partners. So, thank you for sharing, and, yeah, I just have a lot of love and respect for you, so, yeah.
Aw, thanks so much, Serena. I appreciate it, and I think that, like, if you're in these moments where, like, sex doesn't feel great, like, I I know eventually that, like, after, what, 7 years and looking back now, like, I was like, "Wow, I really did that," and at the time, I think it always when you're in a low place, it feels like, "Oh, I'll never get out of here," but, like,
Mhm.
it's we grow and change and we move on from things and we look back and be like, "Okay, well, here's how I've developed now." So I think that if people who are listening are in their lower place, then just, like, knowing that it will change at some point is always good to know. And
Definitely.
just, like,
Oh, sorry,
thanks
continue.
for listening and being interested in hearing in the first place too. I think it's hard to have conversations as, like, a sex positive person that are like, sex isn't always positive, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a very important, like, as you said earlier, like, this is something that a lot of people do experience, and
Mhm,
I think part of sex positivity is recognizing that it isn't always positive, like, there's kind
mhm,
of 2 sides of that. Like, I think of sex positive as looking at sex in a healthy way and
mm,
trying to, I don't wanna say promote it because that sounds weird, like, I'm not promoting sex, but it's kind of almost like the sex education that we didn't get, right? Like,
mhm,
and I think that encompasses all aspects of sex can be a positive thing, it cannot be a positive thing, and as you said, it can kind of, you said, good sex versus bad sex, like, it's not always a dichotomy, it's a lot more
yeah,
complicated than that, and so I think sex positivity is looking at the full range of it.
mhm,
So, yeah.
absolutely. It's important to have the whole picture, and so I like having this conversation because I feel like we're filling in gaps sometimes that I didn't hear about until, I guess, lately as we're having more conversations about this stuff.
Mhm. Yeah, definitely.
Um, so in going into like thoughts and just like processing, I think the things that I didn't know that I wish I knew now, I'm looking back and being like, okay, when I lost my virginity, I didn't know what an orgasm felt like. Um, and I didn't understand how it was supposed to feel like either. Like my partner would ask me like, "Did you come?" or like, and I would be like, "I don't know."
Yeah.
Um, and I think that I hear some people say like, "You'll know when you know," and I think I don't remember that moment when the light bulb clicked for me, but at some point I like started learning. But that it takes time for you to get there, and it takes personal experimentation, and it takes like you really learning your body and how it works
Mhm.
to know that kind of stuff. And I think I wish that I had had that knowledge before going into it now, just like generally being comfortable with your body and understanding it. Like, I think is so important in in sex and sexuality, and just like knowing yourself in general at levels too. Um,
Definitely.
and I think that there are a lot of conceptions about, I don't even know if that's a word that's applicable to this situation, but that's the word that came to mind. But there are just a lot of ideas about sex and sexuality and how it should be. I was the first time, well, like really my whole relationship with this partner, I didn't know that like moaning was a thing. I was like so green when it came to knowing anything about sex. And this is what sparked me wanting to get to know stuff, was like being like, oh, I have to have these experiences now where, or I'm going to have these experiences now where I should know these things. And so for those sexual experiences, like I was quiet and my partner was like, why aren't you moaning? Like, why aren't you saying anything? And so that was like an extra piece for me of just understanding like that people go into sex having an idea of what it's supposed to be like, and just knowing more about like what others expect from me helps me understand like what how to gauge with them and how to communicate with them in a way that's comfortable for me, because like moaning isn't necessarily like a natural thing for everyone, I guess. And so there are just like little pieces that you don't really learn until you go through it,
Mhm.
um, that that I just learned along the way and now wish I knew back then. Um,
Yeah.
I think also for me, birth control was really important for my sense of safety in having sex, and I think that going I had to go through this experience to know that, and now that I do, I just know that it's a part of me. So just factoring in what is essential for you in terms of what makes you feel safe and comfortable is important in any sexual experience. And then also, I think like being ready for sex as a mindset,
Mm.
and in so many ways that's like having the knowledge, being willing and able to communicate with your partner, being ready and enthusiastic for it. Like I I don't want to have sex at a time where I'm like not feeling it. Like that just
Yeah.
doesn't sound like pleasurable and good for me. So I think those are just some pieces. And also like I think that a lot of people are worried about being hurt the first time that they have sex. And I think for anybody who has a vagina specifically, like it's muscular. So you can stretch it out in the same way you can stretch out other muscles. So just know that like if you want to prevent bleeding, a lot of it has to do with stretching, and not like a lot of people believe that it has to do with like popping your cherry or whatever, which like it is a tissue in inside of the vagina that like could be kind of covering the opening, or it could not be. It depends on your body. But any insertion of like working your way up to larger things helps stop any sort of bleeding, I guess. If you want more of a tips and tricks on like
Yeah.
how do I not bleed the first time type things.
Also on that note, really quick is, yeah, I love that tip of stretching because I didn't that's the first time I've heard of that, which it makes a lot of sense.
Mhm.
But another one that I've heard a lot is using lube and making sure that you're
Mhm.
properly lubricated. I'm not sure if that helps as much with bleeding per se, but definitely
Mhm.
with pain. And yeah, it also makes sense that it probably would make it harder for the hymen to tear or the cherry to
Mhm.
pop as you put it. But yeah, anyway, sorry, I just wanted to
Totally.
add that in there.
Oh, I think that's a great tip. I was thinking, it reminded me, I watched this Anna Kana video a bit
I
ago where
love
she
Anaconda.
she read this book, and I have it on my reading list now. It's like just about sex. And one of the facts that she learned was like that the vaginas only lubricate themselves like 30% of the time or so. Or like
Oh,
it's
interesting.
like the vagina doesn't lubricate itself every time, and so it's so important to have lube available for those situations. And I think people equate a lot of lubrication to like being horny, but
Mhm.
that's not necessarily always the case. That your like body sometimes just doesn't work with you the way that you want it to, and sometimes that's also helpful too. So thanks, Serena.
Yeah, that's awesome. I didn't know that. That's an
Yeah.
interesting fact.
And
So, yeah.
don't take me at exactly my word because I just that's from memory. I didn't like fact check myself, but
Yeah.
um just important stuff. And I think overall a big piece of what I recommend too is to have knowledge, like in every aspect, knowledge of yourself, knowledge of what you like and what exists in the world. And I think just basic knowledge about consent and sexuality in general is like important to have, and hopefully knowledge of your partner, at least like do a quick check. Like I know I have a friend who takes a sex quiz with her partners before she has sex with
Oh,
them.
that's so
um
fun.
right. So I think like there's just so many things. I feel like I could have a whole checklist, but like
Yeah.
you I mean, you know when you're ready better than anybody else. But I think my hope is that we all have more sexual experiences when we really feel mentally ready for
100%.
it.
I think that was very well said about having sexual experiences when you're ready for it, kind of tying back to the whole concept of virginity earlier.
Hmm.
You know, whether that's something that you want to wait for or not, or, it's all your experience and just making sure that you're in the proper headspace for it.
Yeah.
And I also love what you said about knowledge in all aspects, like knowledge of yourself, knowledge of what sex is and consent, and knowledge of your partner. Like the idea of a sex quiz sounds fun. I kind of want to
Hmm.
like see an example of that now. But yeah, I don't know. Is there anything else you want to share? I kind of interrupted you there.
No, I think it was weaved in perfectly. So I don't think there's anything else that I really wanted to share. I think like my I'm looking at my notes a little bit, and the last point I think to really nail home for me is like I think it links into something that we're going to talk about later in relation to people pleasing, but like
Mhm.
I think in general for me I didn't understand the importance of condoms and contraception, and I think like condoms and other forms of contraception are so helpful in so many ways. They prevent STIs, they prevent pregnancy, and so just knowing I think what contraception is important for you to have, I think is something that I didn't really think about before. And a lot of people don't have the conversation before of like, are we going to use condoms? And then like people end up like just assuming things. And there's like a whole conversation about that. So there's just like so many different aspects that you don't think of. But just one thing to add to the checklist of things is like just know what contraception you need to make you feel comfortable having sex with another person too.
Yeah.
Important.
Yeah, definitely. And yeah, what you were saying earlier about kind of being a um, birth control patrol and kind of like
Mhm.
helping guide women to figure out what type of birth control they want. Like there's a lot of different options and forms of birth control, and so
Mhm.
yeah, I think kind of being educated on that. And I could do, I think we talked about this, but like I could do like a whole episode on birth control and a whole like series
Mhm.
on it and like hormonal birth control, like the some of the negative impacts that I experience and positive, but like I
Mhm.
think it's told as like, oh, like it's this perfect thing, which is it's really amazing
Mm.
that we have that opportunity to have that, for
Mhm.
birth control and controlling birth. And also, hormonal birth control helps with a lot of other things like
Mhm.
PCOS and irregular painful periods and whatnot,
Mhm.
and different like people who are on birth control, hormonal birth control, it's not always for controlling birth.
Yeah.
But it also has it could have some negative impacts on other
Mhm.
areas of your life that you may not have thought of, that I don't think is talked about as often.
Mhm.
But anyway, I just kind of went off on I'm like, I
It's
went
it
off on a different sphere.
but it's a representation of why it's so important to know those sorts of things. I think going in
Yeah.
like knowing how you're gonna be and knowing how your body works on a certain birth control or whatever it is, like you
Mhm.
just being aware of that while you're in the process of like prepping for sex or
Yeah.
in a sexual act with somebody is important to just know be aware of everything. We have to we have to be
Yeah.
aware of so much. Um
I just have another question that kind of popped
Mhm.
up, as you're talking, because you said something about, with partners and the idea of a checklist and having a conversation with your partner beforehand. So I know you kind of been talking about a checklist of things for yourself before you get into
Mhm.
a sexual experience, but I'm kind of wondering what you would, off the top of your head, put
Yeah.
on a checklist for a conversation with your partner
Mm.
specifically.
I mean, the thing that comes to mind is there's a sexologist on YouTube called Sexplanations, or her show on YouTube is called Sexplanations, but her name is Lindsay Doe.
I'm
Um,
gonna check that out. I
j-
haven't heard of that. It's
j-
explanations.
yeah, John Green and Hank Green kind of like boosted her career
Oh.
when I was in high school, and she was the person that I used to get a lot of my sexual health information from when I first started, when I lost my virginity, like literally in this relationship. And she did a video on a will, want, won't list.
Mm,
And so that's, just putting a list together of like things that you both agree that you want, that you're willing to do. So like things that are kind of in the middle of like, I'd do this if my partner wanted me to. Want are like the things that you're wanting to have, when I think it could be necessarily about sex, or it could be about like aftercare, it could be about foreplay beforehand, like things that you're wanting within the experience
mhm,
itself. So like you could say like, I want to cuddle afterwards, and that could be something that you put on there, or like, I want to do this position more often than others, or things like that. And then won't is like the things that I will not do if you ask me to do, your kind of like red flag areas. And so that's kind of the areas that I think of where you could maybe make a list with your partner, and just like combining sharing your brains and what you already are aware of yourself,
mhm,
with them, so that they're aware. I'm trying to think, because I'm sure that your partner would also have an idea of themselves and kind of what's important to them. So I'm sure that you could fit anything else that's important from your partner's point of view in there too, just like you can fit in the stuff that you're wanting from yourself within that list.
yeah, you can find, like, the common ground.
Mhm.
Yeah. I think that's also a great idea to kind of get a check-in with your own headspace and
Mhm.
what you are feeling, but also it's a great, yeah, springboard for a discussion. Like, it's
Mhm.
if you make those lists, either make them together or you make them separately and you bring them together and, like, you just it's great to just look at that, but also, like, talking about it, and it's a great way
Mhm.
to kind of broach some topics that may be awkward to talk about or bring
Mhm.
up otherwise. So I really like that tip. Thanks
Totally.
for sharing.
Of course, of course. And I that also makes me think about communication, and like, just you make sure that you're able to communicate those things with your partner. And I think if you're not able to, then that's something that you probably want to be aware of before you do anything too. Just knowing yourself well enough. I know for me, sometimes I'm not able to communicate things in the moment because I just want to make the other person happy. And like, I get stuck in a space where I'm like compromising my own values for something that they want. And then I just like freeze and don't say anything. And so communication is really important. I think it's important for me to like let my partners know in those situations, like, hey, if I freeze or if I don't say anything, like, that's me saying that I don't want to do this thing. Um, so extra stuff to either put on the list or just include in that conversation.
Definitely. Yeah, and thank you for bringing that up about freezing because, tying back to consent a bit about consent being an enthusiastic yes. If your partner freezes, then that's probably a good time to check in with them
Mhm.
rather than continuing to do what you're doing.
Mhm.
So yeah.
Agreed, agreed, absolutely. I think part of communication is also being aware of your partner and what's going on with them, and being like, "Hey, I see that you're not focused," or like, "You're not answering the question I just asked you." Like, that's a great time to check in.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you'd mentioned this before, but just kind of reiterating that, like, consent can be revoked at any time, and it's not something
Mhm.
that's just one and done, like it's you can be in the middle of something and maybe they wanted to do it at the beginning or they weren't sure and kind of went forward with it and now they don't want to do it anymore. And
Mhm.
that's totally fine. And same with we did an episode on consent. It was our second episode called What is Consent? And it was focusing more on my friend that we talked to.
Mhm.
She's like in a committed relationship and it was less about consent in terms of like hookup culture and potential like kind of predatory situations, I guess. It was
Mhm.
more about consent in a committed relationship and about
Mhm.
how, maybe one day one of you guys just isn't feeling it. And I think we
Mhm.
touched on this and that's totally fine too, and how it's this ongoing conversation and this
Mhm.
ongoing thing. So I think we've already kind of talked about that and hinted at it, but I just kind of wanted to explicitly state and solidify that before we close out this part 1, because there is a
Mhm.
part 2 and we're going to talk more about people pleasing, and Carly's going to share kind of some of the tips and advice that she's kind of gained from navigating that. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, thanks again so much, Carly, for joining us and for sharing your story. Carly is actually going to launch a podcast of her own. I'm super excited about it. It's called With a Little Help from My Friends because she has great taste in music. And so, if you want to listen to her and her favorite people talk about the plethora of difficulties that life brings and how they navigate it, then you can check that out. At the time of recording this episode, it's not out yet, but it will be launching soon. And you can follow her Instagram account for it at With a Little Help FMF, short for From My Friends. And so, yeah, I don't know, Carly, if there's anything else that you kind of want to talk about with that or the podcast.
No, I mean, I'm so excited to launch it. It's a pod where we talk about everything that has to do with growing up and just I think the struggles that myself and my friends deal with on a daily basis, just kind of what's going on in our heads or what's important to us lately. And so I think it's going to be really relatable and I'm excited to put it out there.
Yeah, me too. I'm excited to hear it. Yeah, I think I told you this too when we first started talking about this episode, but this idea that especially in quarantine, like more now than ever, like having these like just open, candid, real conversations about more than oh, COVID sucks is like
Mhm.
what I think a lot of people are craving and is really like great to have. And as you said, like with listening to conversations and sexplanations and other things, you were able to learn more about sexuality and get to a place where you felt better with yourself and how you experience the world. And so I
Mhm.
think having these conversations, more than just about sex and sexuality, but as you said, like just growing up and things that we've learned and also things that, you're maybe currently thinking about and struggling with, I think that's a great thing, and people hopefully can relate to it, maybe learn a little bit, and hopefully
Mhm.
same with this podcast. But yeah.
Agreed, agreed. Thank you so much for having me, Zarina. I love talking about this stuff. So so happy to get the space to do it.
Yeah, first, thank you again for sharing because I know that's a difficult story to share. So I appreciate you and I appreciate you being on here. Thank you, Carly. Thank you, everyone, for listening. And we'll see you in part 2. Oh, also, I knew I was forgetting something. So you can follow this podcast on Instagram. You can find us at the Virgin and the Bees podcast. So yeah, follow Carly's podcast from A Little Help FMF. Follow this podcast at the Virgin and the Bees podcast. And yeah, share the podcast with a friend if you're enjoying it, if you think they'd like it and enjoy it and benefit from it. And maybe also give us a review and rating on Apple Podcasts. I can't say that word on Apple Podcasts. And yeah, have a wonderful rest of your day and keep on buzzing.